participating in today's webinar. The IFOBA has been running a series of talks to educate the community on clinical trials and FOP. You can access the recordings of prior webinars right on our ifopa.org website. Today's webinar will be on the MOVE clinical trial, which is a study looking at the safety and efficacy of the drug Calavera Teen for FOP. Giving this talk is Dr. Edward Hsiao, Associate Professor in the Division of Endocrinology and Metabolism at the University of California, San Francisco. Dr. Hsiao is an investigator on the MOVE clinical trial at the UCSF site. We also have Dr. Donna Grogan, the Chief Medical Officer at Clementia Pharmaceuticals, and Dr. Grogan will be available for questions during the Q&A portion of the webinar. Just a few housekeeping items. First, you can submit your questions privately through the chat function on your webinar. Questions will be held until the end of the webinar, at which point we will pose your anonymous questions directly to Drs. Hsiao and Grogan. And next, just want to note that we will be recording this webinar for those who are unable to attend today's session. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Edward Hsiao.
Thank you very much, Adam, and also to the IFOPA for giving us this opportunity to tell you a little bit more about the phase 3 MOVE trial that is sponsored by Clementia. I'm going to go ahead and get started, but we're very interested in any of the questions that you may have. So please feel free to submit them as Adam had described, and we'll be happy to answer them at the end of the presentation. So I just want to start by talking a little bit about Calavera Teen. Calavera Teen is a medication that is in this class called the retinoic acid receptor gamma agonists. It's a small molecule. It was been tested in over 800 subjects with 450, greater than 450 patients dosed chronically for up to 2 years. And this was done in preliminary studies that were done quite a while ago, between 2003 and 2013. And basically, it was very well tolerated and has a safety profile consistent with other medications in this class called retinoids. What really changed for the FOP community was a paper that was published in 2011. And this was a study that showed that the retinoic acid receptor gamma agonists could be useful for preventing heterotopic ossification in a mouse model of abnormal bone formation. And specifically, the RAR gamma agonists seem to inhibit some of the BMP signaling and also bind to nuclear hormone receptors. And as a result of, and based on this set of results, Clementia Pharmaceuticals was formed to evaluate Calavera Teen, which is one of the RAR gamma agonists, as a potential treatment for FOP. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, there were 4 dosing regimens that were evaluated in the phase 2 program, as well as completed enrollment of 114 patients in a natural history study. And for the purpose of today's talk, really discussing this phase 3 MOVE trial, which is open for recruitment at the moment. So I just want to step back for a moment and go through a little bit about drug development. And this is an important context for these clinical trials because it sort of tells you where we're headed and why we're doing specific things. And so as we had discussed just a few minutes ago, there were the animal studies, which are called the preclinical studies, and these are basically to show that there is a concept of efficacy and how the drug might be working. But there are also these what we call phase 1 studies, and these phase 1 studies are an opportunity to study the drugs for the first time in humans, basically looking for side effects and looking at drug metabolism. And those studies were completed, as we had mentioned before, by Roche, and this was in over 200 studies. There was also some other studies that were looking at whether or not Calavera Teen could be used for treating a lung disease called COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And that was done in over 600 subjects. And what we've been doing over the past couple of years now with Clementia is this dose ranging study, which is the 201 and 202 studies, which you may have heard about. And these are preliminary, what we call phase 2 studies, where we're looking at efficacy, preliminary studies of efficacy, also understanding the side effects in the FOP population, as well as what we call dose ranging, trying to identify the appropriate dose and the tolerated doses in patients with the particular disease that we're trying to treat. All of this sets us up for what we look at as phase 3 trials, where we validate the benefits of treatment based on the doses that were determined in phase 2. And that information will actually go on to help us with introduction into the market and then the post-approval process. And so this is where we are today. We're talking about the phase 3 trial, which is the MOVE trial that's ongoing. During this entire period of time, we've had the natural history study, which has covered about 2.5 years, 2 to 2.5 years now. And the natural history study has been ongoing to help provide information about the disease process in FOP to inform, to better inform the design of our studies. So, as I had mentioned, animal studies strongly support the concept of using retinoic acid receptor GABA agonists, such as Calavera Teen, to inhibit heterotopic ossification. And what I wanted to show you is a little bit of data from those studies and some follow-up studies that basically showed that if you use a FOP type of mouse model, this is not the exact FOP mutation, this is a related mutation called, Q207D. In these mice, if you increase the dose of Calavera Teen over time, you can get progressive decreases in the heterotopic ossification bone volume. So this was a dose-dependent decrease in heterotopic ossification, and it results from a BMP implant model in wild-type mice, as was published in 2011, and also in the R206 mice that was recently published in 2016 from Eileen Shore's lab. So basically, this finding in this mouse model, as well as in other mouse models, really supported the idea of bringing this into humans. The Calavera Teen phase 2 program has actually been going on since 2014, and actually involves a series of different trial steps. So the first one was this initial phase 2 study, which is what we call the 201 study. It was a randomized, double-blinded, multi-center, placebo-controlled trial that involved 40 subjects, and a total of 40 flare-ups were evaluated. And 10 patients received placebo, 9 received a low-dose regimen, and 21 received a higher dose regimen, which is the 10 and the 5 milligrams. And basically, this was a 14-day treatment course, either 14 days and 28-day dosing regimen with 6 weeks of observation that occurred afterwards. This initial phase 2 study eventually progressed to what we called an open label study, where this was no longer placebo-controlled and everybody received the medication. There were the 40 subjects that were from the 201 trial, and that was extended and carried over into this trial. And they received the dosing regimen in patients who experienced new flare-ups. And so 27 additional flare-ups were assessed in these patients. In 2016, based on initial results from looking at these two portions of data, there was an adaptation to the trial, which allowed us to change the open label extension so that, and this is what we call the 202 Part B trial. We now had a total of 52 total subjects, so 42 adults and 10 pediatrics. And what the main change in this was that we now had 5 milligrams of Calavera Teen administered daily in the absence of flare-ups for the adults. And then basically 20 milligrams and 10 milligrams following a higher dose regimen for new flare-ups and weight-based dosing for pediatrics that occurred following a flare. So 22 additional flare-ups were assessed in this group of subjects. At the same time, we had the natural history study, which was ongoing. And this natural history study enrolled 114 patients. It represents approximately 14% of the known worldwide population. And in those 114 patients, 18 flare-ups were studied in detail, which included all of the imaging and all of the different questionnaires. The objective of this study was really to document the natural progression of FOP and really the relationship between new bone formation, function, and patient-reported outcomes. And just to give you an idea, as many of you may already know, this is a patient at baseline that has no or minimal heterotopic ossification. But one of the subjects here, after 12 months, you can see that there's very dramatic increases in bone formation. But the important part of the natural history study is that this has really allowed the assessment of key endpoints and really how we can document the disease progression over time. And these become critical pieces of information that inform how different types of interventional studies should be designed and can be assessed. So for the patients, the subjects in the natural history study, they had annual follow-ups. There was imaging endpoints, so things like the whole body CT scan and MRI for sites of the flare-ups. There were functional endpoints. Basically, we did some of these assessments looking at how well subjects were able to move and range of motion and their global health scales, as well as symptoms and other measures. We're really trying to look at different types of biomarkers as well as pain and swelling and other types of symptoms. So between the 201, the 202, and the natural history study, all of these, we had a total of 106 flare-ups that had data that we could evaluate. There were 52 subjects who had flares that either received placebo or were untreated. There are 9 subjects that received a low-dose regimen. There were 47 subjects that received this medium dose regimen of 10 and 5, and then 13 subjects that received a higher dose regimen, and then 19 subjects that actually received this chronic long-term treatment. And so we were able to use this to take a look at what might be happening in the FOP patients. And the short of it is that there appears to be greater inhibition of new heterotopic ossification with the chronic and flare-up regimen. So if you look at the CT scans and look at the amount of bone that's formed, in the placebo or the untreated group, you can see that there's a very large amount of bone forms. This is 9,000 cubic millimeters of bone, and this is averaged over all of the different flares and flare sites. By treating with the low dose or just the flare-based treatment only, what you could see is that there was a 75% reduction in the mean bone volume just by treating during the flares. But if you add that chronic treatment phase where the patients are receiving Calavera Teen even without an active flare, what we saw was that in those situations, the flare bone formation actually decreased by over 95%. And these results are based on just the 12-week flare-up imaging, the analysis of the 12-month whole body CT scans to look at bone formation at other sites besides the flare sites. Those are still ongoing. So, but this was really the main driver that helped design the phase 3 trial, was this 95% reduction. So in all of these subjects, we also captured information about safety data. And what we noticed was that the adverse event profiles were very similar between children and adults. And that the main things that were reported was a dose-related increase in skin and mucous membrane adverse events. So these things included dry skin, dry lips, pruritus, which is itching, alopecia, which is hair loss, rash, erythema, so some redness of the skin, and eczema, so some dryness and skin irritation. It was generally relatively well tolerated by most subjects, especially when prophylactic medications such as skin ointments, sunscreen, and lip balms were used appropriately. And 5 of the 23 subjects, so about 22%, had a decrease in their dosing regimen during the flare-ups from when they were on this higher dose, the 20 and 10 regimen. And this was for a variety of causes, either because of the adverse events like the skin issues or for other things that were being followed. We did not identify any treatment-related findings in terms of safety labs, cardiac arrhythmias in the ECGs or electrocardiograms, and there were no growth plates problems in the children, which we were following in the skeletally immature subjects that were receiving flare-up treatment. So the phase 2 data that I just showed you really showed that the efficacy and safety data strongly supported evaluating this chronic flare-up Calavera Teen regimen in a phase 3 trial. And based on this data, Calavera Teen received what's called breakthrough designation from the United States FDA, which would allow us to try to move this forward as a treatment modality for FOP. So the phase 3 program, we call it the MOVE trial. This is actively recruiting. It's a global harmonized protocol that's a result of multiple meetings between Clementia, United States regulators, the EU, and Japanese regulatory bodies. And the key design features are posted on clinicaltrials.gov. This is the clinical trials number, but if you actually just search Clementia or Calavera Teen, the information will also pop up there. And the anticipation is that there will be 20 clinical trial sites in 16 countries on 6 continents. And as each site is added, the clinicaltrials.gov site website will actually be updated for that information. As part of the trial, travel arrangements are provided and costs are covered for all of the study visits. And if anybody is interested in the trial, it's important to speak with both your physician or your child's physician and the clinical site investigator, both about the study, the protocol requirements, some of the potential risks, and also eligibility requirements. So just to show you where things stand right now, the Calavera Teen phase 3 trial currently has 8 active clinical sites, and this is on the map. We have sites in Canada, in France, in Spain, the Netherlands, the UK, and in the United States. And in addition to that, we actually have a couple of more potential sites that are currently going through the process of approving the protocol. And those are the ones shown in red, and there are a number of sites that you can see here. So for the phase 3 trial, the objective is a little bit different from the phase 2 trial. So we're no longer looking at different dosing regimens. We're actually now trying to look at the safety and efficacy of Calavera Teen for decreasing new heterotopic ossification. And this is relative to untreated controls in the pediatric and adult subjects with FOP based on natural history data. So this is a single treatment arm study, meaning that there's basically, if you enroll in the study, you will receive Calavera Teen. There is no placebo group. The natural history study is used as an external control, as well as the existing data that has already been collected. The main endpoint is an annualized change in the new heterotopic ossification volume. And this is assessed by low-dose whole-body CT scans. And this is compared to the untreated subjects from the natural history study. Other endpoints that are being looked at are really the number of subjects in the body regions with any new heterotopic ossification. So this will allow us to also assess heterotopic ossification at other sites besides the flare-ups. The flare-up rate, and physical function is measured by these 2 assessments called CAGIS, which is a physician administered assessment, and FOP-PFQ, which is a patient-reported assessment of mobility. And the key safety aspects that are going to be continue to be monitored include everything from adverse events to clinical labs and electrocardiograms, as well as bone health in the growing children. So the treatment regimen will include a chronic dosing regimen where Calavera Teen is given orally at 5 milligrams once a day for 24 months. And in the event that there is a flare, the subject would increase to 20 milligrams for 4 weeks, followed by 10 milligrams for 8 weeks. There's an option to extend the Calavera Teen treatment if there are persistent flare symptoms. And the dosing is weight adjusted for skeletally immature children. The main enrollment criteria is that we're looking for 80 men and women at least 4 years old with FOP due to the classical R206H mutation. They need to have no flare-up symptoms within 4 weeks prior to enrollment to allow us to get a good baseline assessment of what their usual state of health is. And they need to be able to undergo all of the study procedures, and they do need to reside in the country where a clinical trial site is located. During the clinical visits, there will be clinical visits at baseline at months 6, 12, 18, and 24. During those visits, there will be several assessments done, including the surveys, the CAGES function assessment, a whole body CT scan, and for the kids, hand and wrist and knee x-rays to really assess the growth plates. There will also be other safety assessments that are performed. In between those in-person visits, we have remote visits that occur at months 3, 9, 15, and 21. And at those visits, those will have safety labs that are drawn for the women, monthly urine pregnancy testing, and also we'll also have flare-up visits interspersed. So if there's a flare that we would need for tracking, there would be monthly visits during those high-dose treatments, again for safety assessments. So this is a graphic summary of the study. So once a subject has been screened and they're enrolled, they actually will start on the 5 milligram treatment, and that will continue over the 24 months of the trial. Again, at month 6, 12, 18, and 24, basically every 6 months, there is an on-site visit, and for all of those will include assessments, including surveys, physical exam, radiology assessments, and blood work. And then if a flare were to occur, the subjects do not need to come to our site unless that there's something that we're concerned about. And during those flares, it's basically telephone tracking and local visits with the home care team, where basically there will be assessments about the flare-up. The subjects will increase their dosing to 20 milligrams of the Calavera Teen, and then for 4 weeks, and then decrease to 10 milligrams. And at every month, every 4-week interval, we would have safety assessments. The primary efficacy analysis is basically to compare the change in new heterotopic ossification bone between the subjects treated with Calavera Teen and the natural history subjects. There will be interim efficacy analyses. So basically every year or 3 times during the 24 months of the trial, the teams will meet to make sure and assess how well the drug is actually working. And there is what's called a data monitoring committee. This is an independent committee that's comprised of experts in FOP, as well as imaging and retinoid drugs and pediatric bone disease. And this team helps to monitor the safety and helps perform these interim efficacy analyses. So in our experience, there's been a number of questions that people have brought up. And so I'm just going to go through those very sort of the top 3 questions. One is, why is it necessary to live within the country that is hosting a MOVE trial site? This is actually an important aspect because our ability to ship the investigational drug into a different location across borders is limited. So what we need is that the sites, the people who are receiving the drug need to live in a country that has actually approved the trial. And so that becomes an important logistical aspect. And if this is something that people are considering relocating, this is something that you can discuss with the particular site in terms of what options might be available and whether that actually seems to be a reasonable course of action. Another question is, why is a placebo not being used in the MOVE trial? The way that the MOVE trial has been designed is to use the natural history data that has been collected over the past 2 years. And so what this allows us to do is to decrease the number of subjects that are needed by combining the information from the natural history study as well as the patients in the MOVE trial. This also gives FOP patients the opportunity to be given the Calavera Teen in a controlled environment without having to worry about whether a placebo is being administered or not. And then will participants in the MOVE trial be able to receive their usual care? And the answer is yes. So standard of care for both FOP as well as other conditions will continue. There are a few small populations or small numbers of conditions where we do want to be careful about, and specifically that Calavera Teen is known to interact with some other types of medications. And in those situations, we, as investigators at all of the sites, are available to help with trying to decide what to do in those particular situations. So basically, there are a few drug interactions that we want to be cognizant of and be very careful about. But aside from that, the usual care will continue for all of the conditions. So in conclusion, so we've had 4 Calavera Teen regimens evaluated in the phase 2 trial. We're now enrolling into the phase 3 MOVE trial. The chronic and the flare-up regimen that was optimal, that showed the greater than 95% reduction in the new heterotopic ossification at 12 weeks, is really what we're using now for the phase 3 trial. And this is the one that has the chronic for 5 milligrams as well as the flare-based dosing. And the goal is to have the MOVE trial to determine whether or not Calavera Teen prevents or reduces new heterotopic ossification versus an untreated control group from the natural history study. And if successful, the MOVE trial data will form the basis for regulatory review of Calavera Teen as a potential treatment for FOP. So I'm going to stop there, and I want to sincerely thank all of the participants in the clinical trials, in the natural history study, all of the families, the entire FOP community, for all of their valuable contributions to this research. And it's really been an honor and a privilege to work with both great people at Clementia, as well as the people at IFOPA, and all of the wonderful FOP families, really to try to move this forward. And we're very excited by the potential that we're seeing. So with that, I'm going to stop and we can start taking some questions.
So the first question that was asked is about the blood test requirements. The question is specifically what blood test requirements are there at the various points, for example, 3, 6, 9, 12-month assessments. I'm aware that blood tests took part on repeat occasions over several hours over the phase 2 trial. Is it similar for the MOVE trial or different, and how?
So that's a great question. I'm going to go back to this slide here. So there are blood assessments that are done regularly, both either through an on-site visit or at through home care. And the blood tests are basically 2 different types of tests. One is if a subject has never had what we call PK testing. PK testing is basically a way of understanding how the drug is metabolized in a patient. We do need to do PK testing at the different doses for each of the subjects. And so if a subject is being exposed to the Calavera Teen for the first time, this is something that we would want to do. So at different points within the blood draws, there is a 24-hour procedure where someone will receive the medication and then we would draw blood at regular intervals to make sure that we can understand how the drug is being metabolized in that particular subject. In addition to that, there's also blood draws specifically for safety assessments, and these are things to look at, just basic blood work and blood cell counts, and looking for anything that might concern us in terms of risks or might increase the risk of the subject when they're receiving Calavera Teen. So those are the two types of blood draws. The PK assessments are basically done at different doses. And I think one thing to emphasize is that the protocols for these types of assessments have not really been worked out. And as I had mentioned before about the adverse events, one of the things that we do follow very, very carefully is whether any of the procedures lead to any adverse events. And with the careful protocols that have been developed for the trial, those events have really been kept to a minimum and have not been a major concern at this point.
Okay, the next question is around the, well, let me ask this question first. Someone commented, I think the reduction of bone for chronic treatment is closer to 99% reduction, 131 compared to 9,500. Can you clarify that?
So the reduction in bone, as you may have seen, someone is really looking very carefully at the data, which is great. The reduction of bone that we saw, we labeled as greater than 95% reduction. And one thing that you will notice is actually that the error bars are actually quite large. So based on this, the hope is that, yes, ideally there is 99% reduction, if not complete blockage. But what this does tell us are two things. One is that there's a lot of variability in the amount of bone that's formed. We don't fully understand that, whether this is a site-dependent, where the flare site is actually located, or whether this is a individual aspect between different patients or different subjects. But the other aspect is that this also indicates that there's also the potential that some bone could still form even in treatment with Calavera Teen. So our hope is that, as we gather additional data through the phase 3, we'll be able to get a better handle on what exactly the percent reduction would be expected in the flares. But for now, the feeling is that, yes, it's 95% or potentially greater than 95% reduction in mean bone volume.
And Ed, this is Donna. I just want to add, one additional thing in terms of the importance of recognizing and reporting flare-up symptoms so that we can administer sort of this optimized treatment regimen of chronic daily Calavera Teen of 5 milligrams, but increasing the dose at the time of a flare-up. This slide I think is a great illustration of the importance of that. With flare-up based treatment only, we do see a really nice reduction in HO volume, but we do know that, even a little bit of HO can, impact function. And so by treating chronically and then increasing the dose at the flare-up, we get this, greater than 95%. But that really means patients have to be vigilant and report potential flare-up symptoms and have that discussion with the investigator so that the dosing can be increased as appropriate.
Okay, the next question is about the surgical trial, and specifically just what's the plan for the surgical trial?
Is the question of the surgical trial related to Calavera Teen or for other aspects? I think
Calavera Teen surgical trial.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to defer to Donna on that one because I am not involved in the surgical trial at the moment. But
yep.
Donna, do you have?
Yeah, and I know that we have been talking with the FOP community with regards to this. We do have an advisory board who is, helping us design this trial. We are proceeding very cautiously with, designing this trial and initiating it. Our goal at this point is to really, get the MOVE study up and running and ensure enrollment, goes as expected as we continue to work on the design of the surgical excision. It is still our goal to evaluate Calavera Teen to see if we can prevent the regrowth of heterotopic ossification. But, again, we are still committed to that, but we're not quite ready yet to initiate that trial. Michelle, are you still there?
Sorry, so the next question is about the blood draws, just some further clarification on that. And so the person asks, upon enrollment, I understand that there will be blood draws every 3 months and more often if a flare-up is present monthly. Is there more to it than that?
So the question is in terms of I think the frequency of blood draws. That is the base sort of set of blood draws and safety assessments that are part of the trial. Each trial site has a clinician that is actually very carefully monitoring sort of the status of each subject. And there are potential times where we will request additional blood draws, particularly if there's a safety assessment that looks suspicious or that we need to track a little bit more carefully. So that is kind of the baseline aspect. We try to work with everybody to individualize things, but there are potentially additional assessments or additional blood draws. It's not just blood draws. There could be other situations where we would ask that a subject actually do come to the site so that we can better assess what is actually going on. So there is some variability in that, in addition to what is laid out as the basic safety plan.
Okay, the next question is about HO. It says, in the graph, we see the average volumes of new HO for the different treatment groups. Were there any cases or subjects for whom existing ossification or HO was reduced?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that one?
Sure. In the graph, we see the average volumes of new HO for the different treatment groups. Were there any cases or subjects for whom existing ossification was reduced?
Okay, yes. So the question is really whether or not existing heterotopic ossification might actually be resorbed with treatment with Calavera Teen. That is still something that is currently being assessed. That's part of the whole body CT scans. The assessments that were done here in this particular graph is actually focused primarily on flare site heterotopic ossification. And so that will be something that we would be looking at in the future data. So we do not know the answer to that yet.
Okay, thanks. So blood testing is a popular topic.
Yep.
The question is, going back to the blood testing, you discussed the PK testing. How often would that have to occur? Is that for every time interval or only certain ones?
So basically what we would need to look at is how the medication is metabolized at the different dosing. So the protocol does ask for PK testing at the high dose, the 20 milligram or equivalent, the medium dose, the 10 milligram or equivalent, and the chronic dosing. So that would be 3 sets of assessments.
Okay. The question, I believe, it's around prednisone. I'm not seeing the full question here, but I'm assuming that the question is prednisone still used while you're on the clinical trial?
So yes. So the question is whether or not prednisone would be allowed as part of the clinical trial. So yes, prednisone is still administered for the treatment of the flare. And so what this is standard of care treatment using the regular doses of prednisone that are normally recommended in the guidelines. And on top of that, we add the Calavera Teen.
Okay. Other questions? We'll give you a few moments to send those in. So a question is, so some patients are using CBD oil for pain management. Would they be able to continue using that while they were in the trial?
Yes. So the question is whether CBD oil for pain management is allowed. We have allowed that for topical administration, and yeah.
Any other questions?
And perhaps you might want to just update the participants in terms of the amendment to the protocol, which is going through kind of the approval process.
Yeah, sure.
Sort of the key change there.
Yeah. So thanks, Donna, for bringing that up. I think so. One of the changes that is upcoming is an amendment to the protocol to allow for enrollment of non-classical FOP patients. So patients that have FOP but don't have the classical R206H mutation. So that is upcoming. The protocol has been modified and is going through the approval processes at individual sites. And so we're hoping in the next couple of months that we will be able to start bringing in subjects who have the non-classical FOP mutations. So thank you, Donna, for bringing that up.
So someone asked the question, are these trials completely independent from the Regeneron Lumina trials, or is there any cooperation between the two the two pharmaceutical companies?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the question is whether there's collaboration between the different companies. For the purposes of the drug testing is completely independent because the mechanisms are different and the types of assessments are different. So that needs to be done completely separately. However, all of the people within the community are very much aware of the different trials that are going on, and we try to help each other by sharing tips and really experiences that we've had that would help improve trial design and trial risk, to minimize risks for FOP subjects across the different companies. So unfortunately, because the medications are different, we do have to have separate trials that are independent.
Any other questions? Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions. So Adam, if you want to close it out.
Sure. So I'd just like to thank Drs. Hsiao and Grogan for this great talk. and for taking time out to better educate the community on Calavera Teen and the MOVE trial. I'd also like to thank all of our participants for dialing in. Again, a recording of this webinar will be made available should you like to go back to the content that was presented for additional information. And please be on the lookout for additional topics that the IFOPA will be hosting in the near future. So thank you, everyone, and we'll be speaking soon.
Thanks to everyone.
Yes, thank you, everyone.